April 16th, mid-1945, Okinawa, Western Pacific. Dawn had barely lifted, itself off the sea when Lieutenant Commander Frederick Julian Beckton stood on the bridge of the USS Laffey. He was 37 years old, thin, sharp-eyed, and already awake for hours. Below him, the destroyer's deck was slick with salt spray, the air heavy with fuel fumes and tension. For days now, Okinawa had been a killing ground, not just for soldiers on land, but for sailors like these exposed and waiting. Beckton gripped the rail and stared at the horizon. He wasn't looking for ships. He was listening. Somewhere beyond the pale blue line where ocean met sky, Japanese aircraft were forming, men who knew they were not coming back. The Laffey had been assigned radar picket duty, the most dangerous job in the Pacific. War isolated, exposed, meant to spot incoming attacks early and die buying time for the fleet behind them. The crew knew the odds. Everyone did. Below decks, sailors wrote half-finished letters. In gun tubs, teenagers checked ammunition feeds with hands that trembled despite months of combat. Someone cracked a joke that landed flat. No one laughed. Then the radar screamed. Multiple contacts, fast, low, closing. Beckton didn't hesitate. He leaned forward and issued an order that made seasoned officers exchange. Looks an order so aggressive, so unorthodox, that more than one man would later admit they thought their captain had lost his mind. Instead of turning away, instead of calling for help, he turned into the attack. 14 enemy aircraft were coming straight for them, and in the next few minutes, every decision Beckton made would determine whether the USS Laffey became another burning wreck in the Pacific or something else entirely. The first aircraft broke through the cloud layer at 8:32 hours. It came in low and fast, skimming the waves like a thrown knife, an Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber, its wings rocking as it lined up on the Laffey. The ship's alarms howled, steel echoing with the sound of men running to battle stations. Anti-aircraft guns swung hard to port, barrels tracking the incoming blur. "Hold fire," Beckton ordered calmly. The words cut through the chaos. Some of the gunners froze, confused. Every instinct screamed to shoot, to throw everything they had at the sky. But Beckton knew what panic fire did. He wanted discipline. He wanted precision. And above all, he wanted the enemy close. The Val dropped into its dive. "Fire!" The destroyer erupted. 5-inch guns thundered. Bofors and Oerlikon stitched the air with tracer fire. The sky suddenly alive with orange streaks and black bursts. The bomber shuddered, wings snapping as it caught fire, but it didn't pull away. It kept coming, screaming straight at the ship. It clipped the Laffey's mast and exploded just off the deck, showering the bridge with burning fuel and twisted metal. Men were thrown to the deck. One was killed instantly. Another staggered up, face blackened, and went back to his gun. There was no time to react. Another plane. Then another. By Aero 840, the air around the USS Laffey had become a funnel of fire. Smoke rolled across the deck in thick, choking sheets. The sky, clear just minutes earlier, was now torn apart by explosions and tracer fire. Beckton remained on the bridge, refusing to take cover. His voice steady as he issued course corrections in degrees and seconds. Left full rudder, steady as she goes. Concentrate fire, starboard side. Another aircraft screamed in from the east, this one a Mitsubishi A6M0, its engine howling at full throttle. It took hits, pieces flying off its wings, but the pilot held his line with terrifying resolve. At the last moment, the Zero slammed directly into the Laffey's aft gun mount. The impact ripped men from their positions. Ammunition detonated. Flames climbed instantly, licking toward depth charges. Stacked near the stern, each one a floating catastrophe waiting to happen. Damage control teams rushed in without orders. Sailors crawled through smoke so thick they couldn't see their own hands. One man beat at flames with his jacket until it caught fire too. Another dragged a wounded shipmate away as shrapnel cut into the deck around them. Water hoses burst. Foam sprayed. Blood mixed with seawater and ran into the scuppers. Still the attacks came, At 8:47, a kamikaze plunged straight into the forward 5-inch gun. The explosion obliterated the mount, killing nearly the entire crew in a single instant. The blast shook the ship so violently that men below thought they'd been torpedoed. On the bridge, reports came in, fragmented, urgent, overlapping. Gun crews wiped out, fires spreading, steering sluggish, casualties mounting. An officer looked at Becton and finally said what everyone was thinking. "Captain, we can't take many more." Becton didn't answer right away. He stared through the smoke, watching another aircraft line up for its run, and made a decision that would define the battle and his command. 8:55 hours. Becton gave the order no destroyer captain was ever trained to give. Make smoke. Advance toward the attackers. The USS Laffey surged forward, engines pushing her directly into the kill zone. Thick smoke poured from generators, trying to blind incoming pilots, but Becton wasn't hiding. He was closing distance, forcing kamikazes to commit early, to lose their ideal angles, to face a wall of concentrated fire at point-blank range. Some officers stared at him in disbelief. On deck, sailors barely had time to process the maneuver before another aircraft burst through the haze. This one came so low its propeller seemed to skim the waves. Every remaining gun on the Laffey opened up at once. The plane disintegrated less than 100 yards out, the explosion rocking the ship with concussive force. A second followed, then a third. Shrapnel hail. Burning fuel splashed across the deck, igniting fresh fires. One sailor was blown overboard. Another jumped in after him without hesitation, despite the ongoing attack. At 09:02, a kamikaze slipped through the smoke and struck the ship's midsection. The blast tore open compartments, knocked out communications, and killed men where they stood. The Laffey lost power briefly, the lights flickering as if the ship itself was gasping for air. For a moment, just a moment, the destroyer drifted wounded and nearly blind. Japanese pilots saw their opening. 4 aircraft lined up at once. On the bridge, Becton grabbed the railing as the ship shuddered back to life. He didn't retreat. He didn't signal withdrawal. Instead, he turned the Laffey broadside, exposing more surface, more risk, more firepower. "Engage all targets," he said quietly. The guns answered. One by one, the attackers fell, some bursting apart mid-air, others plunging into the sea in smoking spirals. But every kill came at a cost. Ammunition was running low. Entire gun crews were gone. The deck was a battlefield of fire, wreckage, and bodies. By 09:10, the Laffey had been hit 6 times. She was still afloat. And the attacks were not over. 09 to 15 hours. The sea around the USS Laffey was littered with burning debris, aircraft fragments, fuel slicks, bodies drifting in the wake. The destroyer herself looked barely alive. Her superstructure was shredded. Antennas hung twisted and useless. Fires burned unchecked in multiple compartments. Then the radar operator reported the worst news yet. More contacts, low altitude, closing fast. This wasn't a final desperate lunge. It was another coordinated wave. Becton knew the truth before anyone said it out loud. The Laffey could not survive another full attack like the last one. Ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted. Several gun mounts were silent, not from choice, but because there was no one left to man them. Still, the captain didn't signal retreat. Instead, he ordered the ship to maintain station. On deck, sailors worked. With the focus of men who understood, they were already living on borrowed time. The gun crew, missing half its men, kept firing anyway. Wounded sailors passed ammunition with blood-soaked hands. Damage control teams ignored screams from below decks as they fought fires inching. Toward the depth charges, one detonation away from annihilation. At 09:20, a kamikaze dove straight through the smoke and slammed into the Laffey's forward deckhouse. The explosion tore open the bridge level below Becton's feet, killing men in the plotting room instantly. The shockwave threw officers against bulkheads. Shrapnel cut through the bridge windows. Becton was knocked to the deck. For a split second, the crew thought he was dead. He stood back up, bleeding from the head, his uniform torn. He wiped his eyes and took the con again without a word. The sight of him still standing, still issuing orders, spread through the ship faster than any alarm. If the captain was still fighting, so were they. At 09:28, the final attackers came in. 2 aircraft, then 1 more. They never reached the ship. Every remaining gun opened fire in a single sustained roar. The last plane exploded so close that fragments punched holes into the Laffy's hull, but the ship remained afloat. Then suddenly in silence, the sky was empty. The attack had ended. 09:35 hours. The silence felt unreal. For nearly an hour, the USS Laffy had existed inside a continuous scream of engines, explosions and gunfire. Now there was only the sound of crackling flames and the groan of wounded steel. Smoke drifted slowly across the sea, rising in black columns that marked where aircraft and men had vanished. Becton ordered a full damage report. What came back was grim. The Laffy had been struck by 6 kamikaze aircraft and damaged by 4 near misses. Dozens of men were dead or wounded. Entire sections of the ship were burned out. Ammunition lockers were empty. Communications were crippled. If another attack came, there would be nothing left to stop it. And yet, against every expectation, the destroyer still floated. Below decks, the coast became painfully clear. Corpsmen moved through smoke-filled compartments, stepping over twisted metal and shattered equipment. Wounded sailors lay where they had fallen, some silent, some calling out for help that came too late. Friends were identified by boots, by fragments of uniforms, by dog tags pulled from ash. Damage control teams fought on, knowing that survival didn't end when the shooting stopped. Fires smoldered near fuel lines. Flooded compartments threatened stability. Every mistake now could sink the ship hours after the enemy was gone. At 09:50, a signal lamp flashed from another picket destroyer several miles away. They had seen the attack. They had counted the planes. 14 enemy aircraft had gone after the Laffy. None had succeeded in sinking her. Word began to spread across the fleet. Pilots returning to carriers stared in, disbelief at the battered destroyer still on station. Officers spoke the ship's name with something close to reverence. On the bridge, Becton finally allowed himself to sit. He removed his helmet, looked out over the water, and asked quietly how many men were missing. When the number came, he said nothing. The battle was over, but the consequences were only beginning. By late afternoon, April 16, 1945, the USS Laffy was no longer standing alone. Tugs and escort vessels moved cautiously toward her, threading through debris still floating on the surface. From a distance, the destroyer looked like a burned-out skeleton, mast shattered, hull scarred, decks blackened by oil and blood. Up close, the damage was even worse. The smell hit first. Burned cordite, fuel, flesh. Medical teams came aboard and immediately understood the scale of what had happened. Men were treated where they lay because moving them risked killing them outright. Morphine ran low. Bandages were improvised from anything that could be torn into strips. Becton walked the deck for the first time since the attack. He stepped over wreckage that had once been gun mounts, paused at scorched outlines where men had been standing hours earlier, and stopped often, not to give orders but to look, to remember faces, to ask names, to hear what had happened at each station. At the stern, a young sailor saluted him with his left hand. His right arm was gone. The sailor apologized for not firing faster. Becton gripped his shoulder and told him he had done enough for a lifetime. That evening, the Laffy was finally relieved of radar picket duty. As she turned away from her station, other ships sounded their horns, long, low blasts that rolled across the water. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't ordered. It was respect across the fleet. After-action reports struggled to describe what had happened in clinical language. Words like extraordinary resistance and exceptional leadership appeared again and again. But no report could capture the truth that a single destroyer, commanded by a man willing to charge into death, had stood its ground and lived. That night, as the Laffy limped toward safety, fires finally under control, the sea around Okinawa grew quiet again. But for the men aboard, the war had changed forever. In the days that followed, the story of the USS Laffy spread far beyond Okinawa. Sailors talked about it in hushed voices aboard carriers and cruisers. Pilots pointed out the destroyer as they flew past, its scorched hull unmistakable even from the air. Some called her the ship that wouldn't die. Others simply shook their heads. unable to believe a vessel so badly damaged was still afloat. Official investigations confirmed what many already suspected. On April 16, 1945, the Laffy had faced one of the most intense kamikaze assaults of the entire Pacific War. 14 aircraft had targeted her. 13 were destroyed by her guns. One detonated close enough to count as a hit. Few ships, if any, had endured so much and remained operational. When casualty lists were finalized, the numbers hit hard. 32 men killed, 71 wounded, nearly a third of the crew. Becton attended the burial at sea ceremonies personally. As bodies were committed to the Pacific, wrapped in canvas and weighted with shell casings, he stood at attention, jaw clenched, eyes fixed forward. The medals would come later. But this moment, this silence, was what stayed with him. Back in Washington, naval analysts studied the engagement closely. Becton's decision to advance into the attackers, once considered reckless, was now recognized as tactically brilliant. By closing distance, he disrupted attack runs, forced early dives, and turned the Laffy into a moving fortress of fire. It was a maneuver born not from theory, but from instinct, experience, and an unshakable refusal to surrender the initiative. The Navy would teach lessons from the Laffy for years, but for the men who survived her deck, the lesson was simpler. They had lived because their captain never flinched. The USS Laffy never returned to the radar picket line. Her wounds were too severe. Temporary repairs kept her afloat. But she was sent first to Ulithi, then onward to Pearl Harbor, moving slowly, carefully, like a veteran too battered to rush back into the fight. Wherever she went, sailors stopped to stare. She had become something more than a ship. Naval photographers documented every inch of the damage. Twisted steel where aircraft had struck. Blast scars burned deep into the hull. Gun mounts reduced to molten wreckage. These images circulated quietly through the Navy, silent proof of what men had endured in the skies over Okinawa. For Frederick Julian Becton, the attention was uncomfortable. He refused interviews. He deflected praise. When asked about the maneuver, about charging into 14 attackers, he gave the same simple answer every time. It was the best chance his men had. In September 1945, after the war ended, official recognition finally arrived. The USS Laffy was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the Navy's highest honors. Becton himself received the Navy Cross, cited for extraordinary heroism under overwhelming attack. But medals couldn't restore what was lost. Survivors carried the battle with them for the rest of their lives. Some woke at night to the sound of diving engines that weren't there. Others avoided open skies altogether. Reunions were quiet affairs, filled with long pauses and shared understanding rather than stories. They didn't need to explain. They had stood on a destroyer that refused to die, and they had seen what leadership looked like when the world was burning. Years later, the USS Laffy would be preserved as a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina, a living testament to courage under fire. Visitors walking her decks could still trace the scars of kamikaze impacts, touch the twisted metal, and imagine the chaos of that April morning in 1945. Historians called it an icon of naval resilience, a single destroyer that had faced impossible odds and survived. But the truth remembered most vividly by those who served aboard her was not the awards or the citations. It was the lesson etched into every corner of the ship. Leadership matters. Courage matters. And in moments when the world seems to be collapsing, the choices of one person can ripple across the lives of many. Today, visitors hear the stories, see the damage, and feel the echoes of that morning. It's a reminder that even in the darkest hours, humanity can rise, defy expectation, and endure. That a single destroyer and the men who refused to abandon her could turn chaos into triumph and fear into steadfast resolve. The USS Laffy remains more than a ship. It is a monument to courage, to leadership, and to the extraordinary human capacity to stand firm when everything around you is falling apart.